Okay, welcome back again. We are going to learn Tractate Shabbos, page 18, and the name of the chapter is Yetzias Shabbos, the going out of Shabbos. Chapter 1. We discussed yesterday the Mishnah, and that Mishnah there was many disputes between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. And the Gemara is going to go through all these disputes. So the first one was the dispute about whether you're allowed to soak ink, dyes, or vetch before Shabbos and allow it to do its thing, to work through it during Shabbos. Are you allowed to do that?
Right.
So Beit Shammai said no, and Beit Hillel said yes. So the Gemara is going to discuss why and what's the reasoning. So who is the Tana that has taught the Mishnah? Man Tana nesina smain ledioy zohi shriyosan. First of all, who is the Tana said that by putting the water into ink without mixing them, that's already constitute soaking. The achievement of their being bound into a single mass, and thus their kneading. So, Omar of Yosef Rabbi, the Mishnah is the view of Rabbi. The Tanya Echad Noisin Sakemach, the one who places the flour. Vechad Noisin Samayim, let's say when it comes to dough, to kneading. So, one person puts the flour, one person puts the water. The last one is liable for kneading. If we're doing this thing on Shabbos, one of us placing flour, one of us is putting water. So then who is at fault? The one who puts the water, the last one. Divrei Rabbi. These are the words of Rabbi. Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yehuda Eno Chavat Shegab. Rabbi Yosef says no, they did nothing by one guy putting flour, one guy putting water. They didn't do anything. So when are you becoming liable? Only once you start kneading. Once you dough the dough, you need the dough manually, then you become liable. Maybe Abai says to him, you're only speaking about flour and water because then it's bar gibul, then you can do kneading. What about other things that have nothing to do with kneading? For example, ink, which is not kneadable. Maybe I would say that just by placing, one guy placing the ink, one guy placing the water, I would say that they are not liable on Shabbos. Maybe you shouldn't be chayav. The Gemara says, Lo sal kadak, should not enter your mind. The Tanya, because it was taught in a braiso. One guy who places the ashes, one guy who places the water, another guy contributes the water, and this is reference to the Afer could also mean ashes, could also mean offer, earth. Rav Yosef's ensuing proof is based on his rendering of the Brisa term Afer, ashes. Anyhow, so one guy who places the dirt, another is placing the water. The last one is liable. Divrei Rabbi, these are the words of Rabbi. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Ache Gabriel. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda said he's only liable once he starts to kneading. So once he does manually, he becomes liable. Ashes are not kneadable, and still Rabbi Yossi, the son of Rabbi Yehuda, states that the person is not liable unless he does kneading. So v'dilma my afer, maybe we should say, what is afer? What is ashes? Perhaps the Baita means that afer, ashes, afo dover gibulu, is referring to earth, which is something that is kneadable. Vatanya Efer, Vatanya Ofo. But why one time it says Efer with an Aleph, which would mean ashes. Sometimes it says with an Ayin, Ofo, which would mean dirt, earth. So, Midi Gaba Dodetanya, were these two Baisas taught together? Meaning, do they appear in the same collection of Baisa that must be interpreted as referring to two different substances? Are we dealing with two different substances, or are we dealing with the one, ashes and earth, or it's the same thing? Tanu Rabbon. The rabbi is taught in the Baita Poiskim Mayim Legina Erev Shabbos Im Chashecha. We may open a water channel from spring to a garden Friday just before dark. So you have a water channel, you open it, and it starts going through the channel, through the canal, and irrigating your garden. So you started before Shabbos, and it continues into Shabbos. The question is, you're allowed to do it or not. And it may continue to fill the water the entire Shabbos day. And another scenario of we may place burning incense under articles of clothing Friday just before dark, and they continue to be perfumed throughout using by the incense the entire Shabbos day. Again, it's a type of work that you started before Shabbos and it completes itself throughout Shabbos without you doing anything on Shabbos itself. A similar concept, we may place burning sulfur under silver vessels Friday just before dark, the different types of works that they used to do back then. And they may continue to be sulfurated the entire Shabbos. I guess penetrating them with sulfur throughout the Shabbos.
20. The silver, 20.
And we may place collyrium on an eye, or a dressing on a wound before Shabbos. Erev Shabbos, or dressing on a wound Friday just before Shabbos, before dark, and misrapes v'leches kolam kula. And throughout the day is becoming, it heals itself on Shabbos. But we may not. So far we saw the things you're allowed to do, but things we're not allowed to do. We're not allowed to place wheat into the water mill, unless there is sufficient time that they be grounded, or they be ground while it is still day. So the grinding process cannot be done on Shabbos itself, even though it's being somehow done by itself. It needs to be completely done before Shabbos, unless there is sufficient time when they ground. When they be ground, and while it is yet day, which is still Friday. My time. What is the reason that the Brisa forbids the unaided grinding of wheat to continue on the Shabbos? What do you care? You're not doing anything. Why not? Why not to let the grinding continue on Shabbos? So Amar Rabba Mipnei Mashmaskol, because it makes noise. And maybe because it says that your vessels, utensils have to be idle, they cannot be used. The Tanya B'chol Asher Amarti Alechem V'tishomeru, the pasuk says in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, it says V'chol Asher Amarti Alechem, and regarding everything I have said to you, you shall guard yourself. You should take heed to include idleness of utensils. That your utensils needs to be idle during Shabbos. So the reason the Brisa prohibits allowing the water mill to grind on Shabbos is because of the idleness of utensils. They have to be idle. But according to you, according to what you said, that the Beis Hillel, the school of Hillel, hold that idleness of utensils is not a biblical precept. So what? It is. So Beis Hillel hold that the idleness of utensils is a biblical precept. So if that's so, why are we allowing sulfur and spices to continue into the Shabbos? If it's biblical, why are you allowing that? Because that is also being used. You have to have utensils to sulfurite the garments. Those cases, not also instances of the utensils holding those burning materials, working on the Shabbos. The Gemara answers, Mishum de Kovid Maisa, but you didn't do any Maisa, you're not doing any activity. You're not performing any action on the Shabbos. The Gemara continues, so that's why Beis Hillel permit the utensil work on the Shabbos in those cases, because you're not doing any work. So the Gemara continues, but what about Unin Shel Pishtan? What reason Beis Hillel permit in the Mishnah the heating of bundles of flax to continue into the Shabbos? The heating you start to heat them up before Shabbos, but it continues into the Shabbos. My time will show why they permit it. That's what about the idleness of the utensils? If it's a biblical precept, they have to be idle. The Gemara says, Mishum deloi ovid maisu uminach naicho. Beis Hillel permitted because the oven is not doing an action and is completely passive. The oven is not doing anything. Mitzudas chayva v'dogim, another subject where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were arguing. In the case of traps for beasts, birds or fish, putting traps before Shabbos, and the beast and the birds will be trapped, possibly will be trapped on Shabbos. The Gemara says the Kovid Maisa, where the trap does perform action when it closes on its prey. My time will show. So why Beis Hillel permitted? Because the trap, the way it's built, the moment that it comes in contact with the beast or the bird, it does something to trap it. It closes on the fish or it traps the deer. So why did Beis Hillel permit it? You just said before that the reason why they permitted the bundles of flax to be heated into the Shabbos, you start before and they're continuing to be heated in Shabbos, because there's no action being involved with the oven. But over here with the traps, that we're trapping animals on Shabbos, meaning you're placing the traps before Shabbos, but it actually catches animals on Shabbos. Why is it permitted? The trap is doing something. The Gemara says, there too, the Mishnah is dealing with fish hooks and baskets where the trap does not perform any action in capturing the prey, like certain types of fishing and trapping utensils, I would say, equipment, certain type of fishing equipment, is you putting them and the fish goes in, it can go out, but it just becomes harder for him to get out.
I guess a glue trap for mice are okay too. No,
but yeah, you can say that. But the thing is, with many times the traps for the fish, like they used to have, for example, a big barrel that it has. They would drown the barrel. They have an opening. They put fish inside the barrel. The fish would go into the barrel. The opening is still there, but they would many times they couldn't find their way out.
Right.
So then, when you take out the barrel from the water, you are taking it out with a lot of fish in it. So they will perforate one part of the barrel so you can pick it up.
I know lobsters are not kosher, but it's the same thing with the lobster traps.
Okay. Who is the Tana that said that the idleness of utensils, meaning that your utensils have to rest on Shabbos, you're not allowed to use your equipment on Shabbos? Who is the Tana that said it? It's Rabbi Shaya. No, Rabbi Shaya says, who is the Tana that said it? Beis Shammai v'lo Beis Hillel. It's actually the opinion, it's Beis Shammai's opinion, a precept from Beis Shammai, not Beis Hillel, that utensils have to be idle on Shabbos. Levei Shammai ben kovid ma'isa ben delo kovid ma'isa also. According to Beis Shammai, whether you're doing something or you're not doing ma'isa, meaning there is an activity that is involved. Certain cases where there is something that is happening with the utensils, some kind of movement that is taking place. And sometimes there's no movement, regardless, according to Beis Shammai, it's prohibited. Beis Hillel, distinguish between action that is taking place and action in certain cases where the utensils are not doing anything. So both of them agree that the idleness of utensils is biblical. But according to Beit Shammai, they're taking it a step further and said that even if the utensils are idle and they're not doing anything, but still an animal is being captured, it's still prohibited. Beit Hillel says no. Only when the utensils are actually moving and doing something, a certain motion that's taking place, then it will be prohibited. According to the Gemara, I must address the following difficulty. So now that you're saying that according to Beit Shammai, even if there is no action involved with the utensils, it's still prohibited. If so, why did Beit Shammai permit the burning of spices and sulfur in that brisa? Also, manocha there in the cases of spices and sulfur, the brisa refers to where the incense or sulfur is laying on the ground, rather than in a utensil. So, meaning that there was no utensil involved, and that's why Beit Shammai permitted it, because Beit Shammai said that your utensils have to be idle, and they cannot, even if they're not doing anything, it's still prohibited to derive some kind of benefit from them on Shabbos. Like the case of a trap. So the example of a trap that I brought, you throw that trap into the water before Shabbos, it's doing its thing by itself. I mean, it's not even doing anything, just fish goes into it, and then Motzei Shabbos you're taking out the trap. According to Beit Shammai, it will be prohibited. So he said, what about sulfur? So we said, no, sulfur, there was no utensils involved, it was on the ground. Incense or sulfur is laying on the ground rather than in a utensil. So the Gemara says, Gigis v'ner v'kdero v'shabot ma'itam v'shov Beit Shammai. Why does Beit Shammai permit a brewer's barrel, a lamp, a pot, and a spit to do their work on Shabbos? You do brewing, it continues to do it 24/7, and it may be even for months. The mafkilu of kuri. Beit Shammai, in fact, permit these things only where one declares the utensils ownerless. Only when it's not your vessel, you would declare it ownerless before Shabbos. It's not your vessel. And the fact that it's doing its thing, it's not going to be a problem.
The same because it would be with pickle.
Yes, yeah, preserving, any kind of preserving, brewing, preserving. It's continuing to do its thing on Shabbos. You can't say that in your pickle jar, it did not add flavor to the pickles during Shabbos. It stopped during Shabbos and only continued after Shabbos. It's obviously continuing to do its thing also on Shabbos. So how is it permitted? According to Beit Shammai, according to Beit Hillel, it's not a problem because there's no action involved. According to Beit Shammai, there is a problem, even if there's no action involved. So why is it permissible? Because you declare it ownerless. If you declare it ownerless, then you're allowed to do it. Like we can use it to make it relevant to us. We can say your phone is accepting messages, for example, or emails on Shabbos.
Yeah.
According to Beit Shammai, even though your phone didn't do anything, it was sent. You didn't generate messages. Your phone received messages on Shabbos and emails.
Right.
So according to Beit Shammai, the only way you can derive benefit from these messages, or you can look at them after Shabbos, is if your phone was declared ownerless before Shabbos.
Well, you can do that.
Because if it's yours, it's a biblical precept that your utensils have to rest. And the fact is your phone remained on, it did not rest on Shabbos, it would be a problem.
No, you can have the phone off on Shabbos.
No, completely off, meaning that you shut it off. Obviously, halachically, if your phone was on and you received messages, and you didn't look at the messages on Shabbos, your phone just accumulated some messages during Shabbos, it's not a problem. But according to Beit Shammai, it will be a problem, because Beit Shammai would say, I want your vessels to be idle, even on.
So I know. So you got to delete your whole email accounts.
So if you declare it ownerless, it would be a problem.
Okay, the phone's ownerless, the computer's ownerless, the tablet.
Or before Shabbos, you declare it ownerless.
All my electronics are ownerless.
Exactly.
Great.
So It says, who is the Baita, who taught this Baisa that a woman may not fill a pot with asisius or turmesin? What is these things, asisius and turmesin? It says in number 5 are types of beans. Types of beans that require extensive cooking. So you shouldn't do it before Shabbos because it will actually cook on Shabbos, because it takes a long time to cook them. But then so she would place it on the stove before in the oven before Shabbos, and then it continued to cook on Shabbos. And if he did do it, he has to make a calculation of how long was it cooking on Shabbos. He has to wait that time at the end of Shabbos. So, for example, Shabbos ended at 8 o'clock. He has to, and he takes these beans to cook for 2 hours or 3 hours. He has to wait 3 hours after Shabbos in order to eat those beans. Similarly, another example, if someone fill a barrel of water, and he places this barrel barrel of water into the oven on Friday, right before dark, he shouldn't do it. He shouldn't be doing it. But if he did that, Motzei Shabbos is not allowed to benefit from this water. He has to wait the time it would take to warm up this water. Can we say that this is the school of Beis Shammai and not the school of Beis Hillel? The Gemara says it actually can even be the school of Beis Hillel that would also prohibit placing these items in the oven Friday just before dark. And if you did, you would have to wait the time. Why? Over there is another concern. There's a precautionary measure that the rabbis took, because there's a concern that someone would stir. He would stir the coals on Shabbos to add heat to the oven, like people do with barbecuing, that they would stir the coals to make them hotter. There's the same concern on Shabbos if you're using this type of oven, or in a general oven. Even in a general oven where you can play with the temperature, there's a concern that you might change the temperature on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, if that's the case, going back to the sulfur, with sulfur they can do the same thing. Mugma v'gofus namaligzu. We should also decree that it should be prohibited on Shabbos, because there's a concern that you might stir them up. The Gemara says also there's no such a decree in the case of sulfur. Why? Because if he's gonna stir it, smoke from the coals goes into the clothing and it will damage the clothing, and he wants to avoid smoke. Some places you want to have smoke. In certain cases you want to avoid smoke. In the cases of sulfur on silver utensils, you want to avoid the smoke. So the rabbis said he's not going to stir the coals because it's going to be detrimental for what he tries to accomplish with sulfurating his garments. What about the bundles of flax placed in the oven before Shabbos? Maybe it should also be prohibited. The Gemara answers also similarly. Also, Kevan the Koshlu Zika there, since a draft is harmful to them, people will not uncover the oven to stir the coals. So there's also, people are not going to do it because it's going to be harmful. What about another example that we mentioned, wool placed into the vat? Maybe someone will also stir the coals. We're dealing over here with a vat. It refers specifically to a vat that has been removed from the fire. Maybe still there's an issue with megis. He would stir the content stir the content of the vat on Shabbos. The Gemara answers, Ba'akura v'tucha, refers to the vat where the vat is removed from the fire and sealed. So there's no concern that he would open it. Since it's sealed, he's not going to bother that much to open it and to stir the content. Now that the Master said, now that this was already mentioned, there's a certain precautionary concern or precautionary measure that people might stir the coals on Shabbos. So what about in the case of a pot of raw food? Raw food, it's not going to be cooked. It's going to take a while for it to be cooked. Is it permitted to place it in the oven on Friday just before dark, so that it continues cooking through the evening, and there's no concern that it will come to steal the coals, because he knows, the person that places the pot, he knows it's not cooking for this evening. He's not going to eat it this evening, so there's no need for him to start stirring it. So he would not stir it, because it's not going to be ready anyway. My time, so why is it prohibited? The Gemara says, since it is not fit for the night in any event, he diverts his attention from eating it that night altogether, and he will not come to stir the coals. And similarly, regarding a pot of cooked food, it is proper to let it simmer on the fire during the Shabbos, since there is no concern that one might come to stir the coals. However, in the case of a pot containing food that is cooked, yet not cooked, meaning partially cooked food, it is forbidden to leave it on the stove during the Shabbos. Why? Lest one come to stir the coals. But if one threw into it, meaning he threw into the pot containing partially cooked food just before Shabbos, a raw piece of meat. So he has, for example, a cholent pot, that there is a partially cooked food, let's say 50% is cooked, and right before Shabbos he realizes he's going to have more guests, so he takes another piece of meat, cold, from the refrigerator, and he places it into the same pot. Then it is proper to keep the pot on the stove during the Shabbos. The Gemara says, again, for the same reasoning that he's not going to stir it, because he knows it's not going to be ready for this evening. Anything that a fire is harmful to. Lo megalele, he may be left in an oven because people will not uncover it to stir the coals. Abisal the gad yusrik. Then in the case of a kid meat, lamb meat, what's the issue with the lamb meat, which is tender and is therefore harmed by draft, and an oven whose cover is sealed with clay, it is clearly proper to allow the meat to roast in the oven on Shabbos. At the other extreme, where the meat is that of a mature ram, which is tough and thus unaffected by a draft, and the oven is not sealed. Also, it is clearly forbidden to allow the meat to roast in the oven on Shabbos. The Gadia v'lei Sarik, in the intermediate cases of the meat of a kid and an oven that is not sealed, the Vachu Sarik, or the meat of a ram and an oven that is sealed, Ravashi Shori ve'Rabbi Medifti Osir. Ravashi permits the roasting to continue on Shabbos, and Ravirmia Medifti Osir, and whereas Ravirmia of Difti prohibits it. Ravashi the Shori, and according to Ravashi, that permits the roasting to continue on the Shabbos. Vatenan, why? We learned in a Mishnah below, Ein Tzolim Basar Basar Veitza Ela Kadesh Tzolom B'Yom. One may not roast meat, onions, or eggs on Shabbos unless there's sufficient time for them to become roasted while it is still day. Gemara answers also the Vachav V'Lo Ravashi will explain that the Mishnah there refers specifically to the case of the meat of a mature ram and an oven that is not sealed. Ikadam, where the Gadio, Bein Silik, Bein Lo Silik, are those who say that whether the oven is sealed, meaning that it's not going to be easy to access the content, or it's not sealed, that will be easy to access. Shapir Dami, it is clearly proper to allow the meat to roast in the oven on the Shabbos. Why? The Vachanam Usri can, even where the meat is of a mature ram, if the oven is sealed. Shapudam, it is clearly proper to allow the meat to roast in the oven on the Shabbos. Kiplegi, when is the dispute? Where do Rav Ashi and Rav Yirmiyah of Difti disagree? The Vachav V'Lo Yisrael, they disagree whether in a case where the meat is of a mature ram and the oven is not sealed. Mature ram and oven is not sealed. Then he wants to accelerate the cooking and he might stir. The Ravashi Shori, Ravashi permits one to allow the meat to roast in the oven on the Shabbos. But Rabbi Yirmiyah of Difti also was Rabbi Yirmiyah of Difti prohibits it. According to this version, the Gemara asks, will Ravashi the Shori, and according to Ravashi, who permits roasting of any meat in an oven to continue on the Shabbos. Vatenan, we learned that we're not allowed to do it with meat, onion and egg. Vatenan, ein tzoilin, bosel, veitzu, we may not roast meat, onions or eggs. Ela kedeshit solom bodiyam, you have to wait for them to cook. They have to be cooked already before Shabbos for them to stay on. The Gemara answers also Ravashi will explain that the Mishnah there is dealing with meat roasting over open coals rather than in a closed oven. In that case, even Rav Ashi agrees that we must be concerned that one might come to stir the coals since they are exposed. Amar Ravina Eiko Chayo. In this case of raw squash, Shapir Dam, it is proper to let it roast in an oven on the Shabbos. Kevan the kosher lizik of, since a draft is harmful to it, so it's not going to add more draft. Kiviso the gadya dami, it is like a kid meat, which may be left roasting in the oven on the Shabbos, as stated above. So in 41, Ravina, who bases his permit on the similarity of squash to kid meat, squash and kid meat have their similarities, implies that it is forbidden to allow ram meat to roast in the oven on the Shabbos, unlike the ruling of Ravashi. And the second version, others suggest, however, that Ravina does not mean to rule contrary to Ravashi, but simply to observe that roasting raw squash would be permitted according to all views. But Shammai and Mochim, but Shammai would say we may not sell to a Gentile on Friday. Beis Hillel says you're allowed to sell a Gentile on Friday right before Shabbos. Tanu Rabban, Shammai says you're not allowed to sell your articles to a Gentile. You should not lend it to him right before Shabbos. You should not lend it to him right before Shabbos. You should not give it to him right before Shabbos. Just for meaning, unless there is sufficient time for him to pick it up from you and make it to his house before Shabbos. Beis Hillel says, this act of all these acts above, lending, giving a gift, and the like, are permitted even if there is only sufficient time for the Gentile to reach the house nearest the wall of the city in which the Gentile lives. The first house in the city that he lives will be sufficient to Beis Hillel. So Beis Hillel are much more lenient in this case, as usual, and they say you're allowed to give it to him even if he just makes it to the first house of the city that he lives in. Rabbi Akiva, these acts are permitted even if there is only sufficient of time for the Gentile to leave your house, the house of the Jew. Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda, Henen divrei Rabbi Akiva, Henen divrei Beis Hillel. The words of Rabbi Akiva are the words of Beis Hillel. Really, what Rabbi Akiva was saying was expressing the view of Beis Hillel, even though it sounds different. Rabbi Akiva only came to interpret the words of Beis Hillel. Meaning that you're allowed to do it if there's enough time for the Gentile to take the article from your house and to take it into the street. The Gemara cites another dispute between Beit Shammai and Beis Hillel in matters of selling to a Gentile. A person may not sell his chametz to a Gentile. Not allowed to sell leaven, dough that rised. Unless you know that he's going to eat the chametz that you gave him before Pesach. Divrei Beis Shammai. These are the words of Beis Shammai. Uveis Hillel, and Beis Hillel would say, "Kol zman shemutar leochlo, mutar lemochlo." As long as you are allowed to, meaning as long as there is enough time, meaning it's permitted to eat it, it's permitted to sell it. When a goy is allowed to eat, a Gentile is allowed to eat chametz and Pesach.
Right.
Beis Shammai said, no, he has to. Yeah, you're only allowed to sell it to him unless he finishes it. He eats it before Pesach. Beis Hillel says if he's permitted to eat it, you're allowed to sell it to him right before Pesach. Mutar lemochlo. Kodman shemutar leochlo. As long as he's allowed to eat it, he's allowed to sell it. Rabbi Yehuda, third opinion, Rabbi Yehuda says kutach habavli, Babylonian kutach, which is a dipping sauce made of sour milk, moldy bread crust and salt. Those who didn't have breakfast today, there's a good suggestion over here for breakfast. Dipping sauce made of sour milk, moldy bread, and salt. So since it is used as a dip, this kutach habavli is a dip, rather than eaten by itself, it takes a long time for it to be used up. Sauce is something that you only dip and you use a little bit. Like ketchup would last more in the refrigerator than I guess fruit or vegetable, because you eat the fruit. The mayo and the ketchup would stay longer because they're just used as dips. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, this type of a dip you are not allowed to sell 30 days before Pesach. It is forbidden to sell for 30 days prior to Pesach, obviously because it's chametz, and the Gentile will have it from you, and you will carry it throughout Pesach. And there's also a concern that maybe he would sell it to a Jew after Pesach. There's also a concern with that. It says in number 2 in the notes, Rabbi Yehuda follows Beis Shammai's opinion, takes the more stringent opinion, that one must see to it that his chametz is destroyed or consumed before Pesach. Thus, one may not sell kutach, this dip, to a Gentile 30 days before Pesach, since it is likely that some of it will remain when Pesach arrives. And one may sell other chametz foods to a Gentile within 30 days of Pesach. However, as he can assume that they will be consumed by the time Pesach arrives. More than 30 days before Pesach, however, Beis Shammai agree that one may sell chametz to a Gentile, even if the chametz will still be intact on Pesach, for the removal of chametz obligation begins 30 days before Pesach, the time when we begin to inquire about and expound about the laws of Pesach, which we are going to discuss in a few minutes. We'll learn halacha on Pesach. But the custom is to start learning these laws 30 days before Pesach. There is no requirement for one to ensure the destruction of chametz that he has relinquished more than 30 days before Pesach. At least this is the opinion of Beis Shammai. Bruchim Tiu, thank you all for watching, and we'll go to the next segment of halacha shortly.